Pronounce Pankit
Secure tech.
Square Tech. Hi everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Digital Success Exchange. We have with us today Mr. Pankit Desai, co-founder and CEO of uh, SecureTech. Pankit is a veteran in the industry with over 25 years of experience. His responsibilities at SecureTech include business development, fundraising, and operations. He has spent over a decade in the US with roles ranging from global sales, operations, management across companies such as Entity Data, IntelliGroup, and Wipro Technologies. We also have we also have with us our lead data scientist, Mr. Deepak Singh from INT, who would be taking the discussion ahead with Mr. Pankit. Very interesting topic today. We are going to discuss what can banks do to improve customer safety against online fraud and security attacks. But before we begin here, here's a short introductory video.
Hi Pankit,
Hi Deepak, how
thanks
are
a
you?
lot. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Thanks Pankit for sparing your time for this wonderful discussion. Before delving straight into the questions, I would like to have your initial thoughts on this topic of online frauds and cyber attacks in banking industry. So if you can just give a brief introduction, what it relates to, that would be really great, Pankit.
Sure. So, security is always an aftermath of a transformation that happens in any industry. And the transformation in this case happens to be the digital transformation. If you look at how industries have evolved, so if you look at banks themselves, they were traditionally a brick and mortar enterprise with physical networks all across the country. I mean, people used to, or the bankers used to pride themselves into saying that we have X thousand numbers of branches and X thousand numbers of ATMs, and that's how we reach out to the customers. In that environment, there is a level of assurance or surety that gets baked into the process that gives the consumer a comfort when they carry out transactions. Early 90s and towards the late 90s, as technology started becoming part of the banks with core banking solutions, and then as internet became far more prevalent in India with mobile banking, internet banking, RTGS, IMPS, UPI, Beam, there's so much of transformation that has happened in the country that almost overnight, in within a decade, the way we have chosen to carry out our day-to-day transactions with the banks have completely changed. I do not remember when I last went to my bank. I frankly don't remember if I have gone for the last 7 8 years, probably longer. And my entire work gets done, right? So I don't even remember writing a check. I don't think I have exhausted my checkbook for the last, whenever it was issued to me a few years back, right? Well, everything is today connected. While it has become a phenomenal ease of use and experience from a customer point of view, it also brings in series of challenges as the country transitions from a technology novice to a technology expert in terms of a consumer perspective, right? So in the metros, you have now the younger generation very, very comfortable using technology. But you have the older generation in the metros and the generic population in the rural areas who has adopted technology but isn't very conversant in terms of how to use it. And because of this, it lends itself to a scenario where, because you are not very comfortable using it, there are potential loopholes that can be exploited by nefarious characters who in turn can carry out transactions, or whether it is the phishing attacks, or whether it is the sniffing of the OTPs, or social engineering attacks, any multiple different ways in which, because you are not familiar with the environment, because you are not familiar with the potential risk, and this is in spite of RBI doing a phenomenal job using celebrities, sending notifications, banks doing so many things, you have a good chance that you might be caught off guard, which in turn can result into you carrying out a transaction or someone else carrying it out on your behalf and you not being aware of it. Yeah. So it's just a natural outcome of how the transformation has caught the entire country completely unawares, if I may. And in the last year and a half in the COVID world, it was just accelerated like X-fold, right?
Yes, very true, Pankit. So, as you said that we have seen the transition from branch-based delivery to multi-channel services. Don't you think that this transformation has opened newer opportunities for the criminals to operate and exploit?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It has. It has. As I said, you have uh, the mobile banking platforms issued by the banks. You have this whole open banking platforms. You have this fintech companies in the mix. You have e-commerce engines that kind of do transactions, or you carry out transactions through them. I mean, there's so many opportunities for you to interact, or so many ways that you interact with the banks today, that the weakest link in the entire value chain could potentially be exploited by the characters. So the weakest link could be you as a consumer, the weakest link could be the fintech player who's in between, the weakest link could be the cell phone provider whose device is hackable, the weakest link could be the network that you use, your Wi-Fi network, that can be abused. There are so many ways and so many places in which we are exposed today as citizens, as consumers, that a potential transaction can be carried out without you even being aware of it.
Yes, and because of this digital platform, the banks obviously they are using this digital platform to reach out to the masses, right? As you said,
Yes.
there were brick and mortar kind of formula which was used by these banking operations earlier, but now they are they had limited reach to their customers. Now because of this internet and everything going digital, they can reach to n number of consumers and
Yes.
customer base, right? Now, if I look from a customer perspective, right, how secure is a customer in this online fraud scenarios and cyber attacks in terms of banking industry that we're talking?
So if you were to look at gross numbers, things aren't that bad, right? So if I recollect recently, the UPI did, I may be wrong, but I think it was some 12, 13 crore transactions that happened in the month. If you were to look at the number of frauds that might have been perpetrated, the number may be a very, very small percentage, right? So at a gross level, you may be in this sense of complacency that, hey, the gross numbers aren't that bad. It's most like the whole COVID situation, right? In
Yeah.
130 crore people, we lost 400,000 lives. Now that's big, but you start looking at the gross numbers,
Yeah.
it doesn't look as bad compared to some other countries. But
Yeah.
as far as the individual is concerned, the the family that lost the life, for them it's a big issue, right?
Yes.
Because for them it hit them close to the home. It's very similar in this whole the cybersecurity or the risk world, right? So at a gross level, we are kind of okay, but for someone who's lost 10,000 rupees, 1 lakh rupees, or any of that combination thereof, it's a big issue. So there is a challenge that comes in terms of people starting to consume these technologies, and then there is this whole risk that comes attached to it. Fortunately, at least at this point of time, the RBI has made it a bank's responsibility that in case of a cyber fraud, if the fraud gets perpetrated using the blind platform, and so long as you inform in a specific period of time and you file the FIR, you are made whole, right? Now, but there are a lot of gray areas in between when you start using multiple intermediary platforms, because then the issue comes is then who's liable. If you're using, let's say, an XYZ's payment gateway, XYZ's payment applications, someone else's wallet, but your bank account, or someone else's credit card, your bank account, and some intermediary application in between. And if a fraud happens, then how do you count the time and who's responsible for it? Is the fraud get committed because the platform was weak or you were weak, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the challenge that one has to grapple with.
Correct. Very true, Pankit. Now, moving on to the next question, Pankit, you talked about open banking, right? If you can throw
Yes.
some light about this open banking concept and what are the challenges in this open banking system when we cater to online frauds and security attacks, that would be really great.
So I'll talk about the positive side of it, and then I'll talk about the risk side of it. So the positive side has been is that if you look at it, banks, generally speaking, have shied away from innovation. Right? They were very happy doing what they were doing, and it is only the startup ecosystem that really came out of nowhere, using the mobile platforms, the internet capability, the Aadhaar capability, and transformed the entire banking, or for that matter, the financial services ecosystem that we today are exposed to. Today, a neighborhood uh, sabji wala also will take a Paytm or a Google Pay, right?
Correct.
A
Correct.
bank would never have done that, right? Ability to get that merchant ecosystem going all the way. So, on one side is the consumer ecosystem, other side is the merchant ecosystem, and these guys are the intermediary. That happened primarily because all of these new age companies came and created platforms that made it accessible, easy to use, and really made it mass market, so to say, right? So that's a great side of it. The downsides are a few. There isn't a standards framework that governs all of these beyond some RBI guidelines here and there, right? So each one is going out, building their own platforms, trying to differentiate themselves so that they can provide an additional value to either the merchant or to the bank or to the consumer. When you don't have standards, you potentially can run into an issue of a specific piece of technology being built without any or without core security constructs in mind. And these days, if you look at the kinds of attacks that are happening, they are all called what is called supply chain attacks, by which supply chain is not in the traditional context of supply chain. Supply chain basically means anything that is part of an ecosystem. A software is a supply chain, your bandwidth is a supply chain, your server is a supply chain. Anything that you consume in the organization is a supply chain. Now, when an attacker goes after supply chain, what it means is that if I attack the one part of supply chain, wherever that components are being used, I am potentially exposing myself, or I'm trying to leverage that one to many attack. So because you have the startup ecosystem coming in, building this capability without a core standards and process in mind, and thereby delivering a kind of a weaker security product, making it attractive for a cyber criminal to go after it. And the whole intent is that if I hack into one, I can hack into many. So that is one problem that has come up in this whole open banking situation, where capabilities are being built without a commensurate understanding of what the underlying security risks are. And more often than not, even now, so we deal with a lot of, we speak to a lot of this fintech companies and banks. The security construct is still a compliance centric. So I will do what is needed for me to comply to a bank's
Correct.
requirement or to an RBI's requirement. The thinking is not to build a core security enabled product that can give a level of assurance. So that's where the
Yeah.
challenge is lying on this whole open banking world.
Very true, Pankaj. So I think the mindset should change from what is we call it from compliance to reliance
Yes.
pattern. Okay. Now, Pankit, because of this digitalization and because of this numerous applications being built and used by these banks, financial institutions, there is whole lot of data getting generated, right?
Yes.
transactional data, customer centric data, marketing related data. So what is your take about how data analytics can help in preventing these types of frauds happening in banking industry?
So think about it from a two angles perspective. One is the fraud angle. The fraud angle being someone either on the intermediary side or on the consumer side or on the bank side is exploiting the weakness that an organization has to carry out a fraud, right? Uh, More like an insider activity, right? And I am aware of a specific case where, for a very long time, that organization used to transact on their exchanges with the intermediary were not encrypted. They're going on open files. So it's very easy for someone to do what is called as a man in the middle attack. So they basically tap into your environment, and because it's an open file that is going, they can intercept it, change the data, and send it back to you, right? And it's the weakness of the platform that was built that was abused by some intermediary, right? So one is the fraud angle that gets perpetrated by the internal actors, and then there are the cyber criminals who take advantage of the weaknesses that individuals have in terms of carrying out a social engineering attack. When someone will call up saying that, hey, your credit card is blocked, and you need to you'll get an OTP, and you tell me the OTP number, and you give me the credit card number, and the way they call and the way they behave is so genuine that it becomes very difficult, specifically for older people, for whom this is a very new concept and haven't become very conversant with it, to kind of end up giving it. So what can the banks do is understand the behaviors over a period of time. Because you're collecting enough information, you start understanding what is the normal behavior of my consumer. Now, the challenge will lie is that you have millions and millions of consumers who carry out tens and hundreds of transactions on a monthly basis. How do you create a baseline behavior? But there needs to be some sort of a capability, and today it kind of exists. So let's say if you are not using your credit card outside of India, and suddenly I see transactions happening in Nigeria and Europe and up in the US, let's say, for that matter, but I see one transaction on my card happening in Mumbai at 7 o'clock, and I see another transaction at 8 o'clock in the US, then I definitely know that this is out of ordinary. So some amount of data crunching does happen, allowing you to understand how the behavior of the individual is shaping up, and then based on that, take some sort of a remedial measure or a process, but verify and then process, right? Instead of process and then verify. So you kind of put it on hold, verify if it is a genuine transaction or not. And I've been through it. I bank with a couple of large private sector banks, and I was traveling abroad, and I was there in the store using my credit card, and the card did not go through, and I immediately got a call from the bank saying that, hey sir, are you actually traveling, and were you using this bank or this card at this specific store or not, right? So there are capabilities that exist. Now, how widespread can that be made? Now, I'm a privileged customer of that specific bank, and maybe that service is available to me. What happens for the regular user, a rural user, or for that matter, someone who's banking through a cooperative bank ecosystem, or someone who's banking through some bunch of fintech companies that have come up? So, how pervasive that can be made is a question. So, the technology exists, the capability exists. It's a question of how that specific organization ingests that technology in its mix to be able to give that comfort to the consumer that, hey, you know what, we have you covered.
Correct, Pankaj. So, in terms of percentage, if I ask, what percentage of banks they go into pervasive action of implementing those, in implementing analytics to detect and prevent fraud? What would be the approx percentage of banks using these analytical tools?
I would say very small percentage and mostly restricted to the larger banks. If you look at it, India, I think there are about 1,500 cooperative banks. There are, I think, about 56 or 60 scheduled banks, some MNC banks, then public sector banks. So if you were to look at it, the acceptance of technology in the environment is, I mean, you'll find them across the spectrums, right? So I'm sure a State Bank of India and HDFC Bank and ICICI Bank and some of these have that capability built in, and they've done a great job in building this platform. Some of the banks not so, and you sometimes wonder if, no, and I don't want to sound conspiratorial in this story, but you sometimes wonder if that the more transparency you create, the lesser chance of you having to manipulate the systems, right? And
Correct.
you never know why some things don't get accepted. Just recently, there's a case of a private sector bank and their microfinance unit. They apparently processed some 80,000 loans without any verification, automatically got dispersed. Now, how is that automatic dispersal possible? And there's no way it's possible. The organization is existing for a quite some amount of time, but there is something out of ordinary that happens, and it's only the whistleblowers in those organizations, when they raise the sting, it comes out, right? So I think you will have to look at it at this as a journey that is driven by a competitive landscape, in the sense that I'm getting that service from XYZ bank and I'm not getting it from here, and I as a savvy user may want to move out, or through a regulatory mechanism, right? That an RBI or someone comes and says that you got, just like core banking was an RBI mandate. And there you have no choice but to implement core banking systems, right? You can't run on the branch automations, what used to be there before, before core banking came.
Correct.
It all went away, right? So these are things that get either mandated through the regulator or will happen through the competitive landscape push.
Correct. Correct, Pankit. Uh, Pankit, in your talk, you just mentioned about behavioral data analysis, right? Understand whether those transactions are in normal parlance, whether there is any red flag using those behavioral analytics. Now, if you can throw some light on, if we can use this behavioral data, or you can say social data, or geolocation data, in order to create a targeted marketing campaigns to these customers. uh, your thoughts on this?
So this is a hotly debated topic for a few reasons. One is the whole issue around privacy, right? And there is a significant pushback that is coming from the regulators, from government, from citizens, in terms of what data can be used by organizations for a targeted campaign to me, right? And if you start seeing, if you today use Apple phones, if you have an app, it will start saying that allow this app. Basically, when you start the app, it will tell you whether you want that app to track you or not, right? And by default it is no, unless you explicitly give permission for allowing the app to track. You
Correct.
can also say it only track while using or whatever, something like that, right? I'm sure over a period of time, most of these other providers also will start going down that route. So there was a period of merrymaking, if I may, in the last 10, 12 years, where it was free for all, where all sorts of data was used, abused, depending on how you look at it, for variety of purposes. I suspect, and my belief is that over a period of next 4 or 5 years, you will see that going away, which basically will mean that as organizations who offer services to their consumers, they will have to become smarter in terms of what information can they capture to give a targeted offering to them, right? So there is still a period of gray area, but in my opinion 12 to 24 months, and it's going to go away, in terms of you can't track my social media, you can't track my geolocation, you can't
Mhm.
track my SMSs. So today, there are companies that very proudly say that I'll give you a customer profile by the spend that they do, because I'm scraping the SMSs, so I know how
Correct.
much money they earn, what is coming in the bank account, and where they spend the money and how they're spending the money. Um, I specifically, as a consumer, I don't want it. I don't want anyone to know what I'm spending the money on, because I don't know how it's going to get abused, right? And who's selling the data to whom, right? For all you know, you may send it to a kidnapper, and that someone will land up outside my door trying to do something with me if I'm spending, lakhs of rupees on something that, or booking tickets or traveling or whatever. So I think there
Correct.
is some other way in which you'll have to find out. The way it is being done today, in my opinion, a matter of time to go away.
True, Pankit. Because of this privacy issue and I won't allow someone else to track me, right? So
Yep.
this behavioral and the social data collection of the companies will obviously land into soup. Now, I'll take your example, Pankit. That I don't want banks or the digital companies to track and understand my spend behaviors, right?
Yes.
Consider a scenario. I'm a student, right? uh, or I don't have any historical financial transaction, but I want to avail financial assistance from banks, right? I reach out to them. I ask for financial assistance, but they deny on the context that I don't have favorable historical financial transactions, right? So,
Yes.
do you think if I, as a consumer, want that financial assistance, bank says that you need to, share with me your spending habits, right? That if I grant you 100 rupees loan, based on your spending habits, I need to ascertain my risk of lending money to you, right? So,
That
do
data
you,
is
yeah,
that data is already available, right? So there are these credit rating agencies, Sibyl and Care and bunch of those, that track not your spend but your ability to pay back, and are you paying back on time, right? So for a lender, the important thing are only two things: how much have you borrowed,
hmm,
and did you pay it back on time? That's all it matters, right? So the more you borrow and the more you pay back on time. So more you borrow is a factor of your credit worthiness or credit capability, and the more you pay back on time is your credit worthiness, right? And that you build over a period of time. But if I, let's say, took a personal loan of 10 lakh rupees, right, I don't want the bank to know whether I spent it on my house or a vacation or buying XYZ. But yeah, you will want to know that I took a 3-year loan for 10 lakh rupees and I paid it back on time, and my credit history is completely spotless, right? So that information is there. The problem that is there is where you spend the money, how much. Oh, every Friday I go out for dinner, or every Saturday I go to the specific place and have a drink. Why would I want anyone to know that information, right? That's the problem that is being debated now.
yeah,
um, there is a school of thought that says I don't care as a consumer if that gives me a better service or
yeah,
better discounts. And then there's a school of thought that says my information is my information and no one needs to know about it, right? At this point of time, the ball is in the first court in terms of the way the companies are operating, but the regulators and the governments and the uh, some part of citizenry is up in arms against the second part, and we'll have to see where the coin falls on which side.
correct, Pankit. Moving on to our next question, Pankit. How can banks build a system to analyze the risk associated to any customer? An efficient risk based system to analyze your customers' risk score.
So, two parts to it. One, when they onboard the customer, and then second is through the life of the customer, right? So today, when they onboard you as a customer, so let's say if you are just new to the bank, they will give you a certain set of minimalistic services based on what you submit as your initial set of, so your KYC, or your customers capability, right? So how much are you earning, where do you stay, they come to your home, they check your home, bought home, rented home, how many years you're working. So there is some amount of technology that is become part and parcel of it to be better able to understand certain or rather better able to understand onboarded consumers based on the past history. So if you have a salaried job and you've been working in the same company for 10 plus years and your salary is decent and you have your own home, then it fits a certain profile, if I may. Once I become a customer, then bank obviously has all the information based on how I have behaved with that specific bank, right? So I've banked now for 4 or 5 years. What is my behavior with the bank? Have I taken and availed of more services? Have I been a good customer of the bank? Is my deposits quite high? Is my savings quite high? Am I paying back on time? A bunch of things. So banks actually do use that information very, very well, right? And that's how the targeted offerings of home loans and personal loans and auto loans and the amount of calls that you get today
Yeah,
is crazy, right?
correct.
Because banks harvest that specific information, right? So that already exists today. So I don't think anything else needs to be done for the existing consumers. If you want to get new consumers, is where the big battle is being fought, right? So how do you onboard uh, huge number of customers to your side of the house? Now, there is a classic debate of, so with Jandan, massive number of Indian populace was onboarded and is onboarded onto this whole zero zero balance accounts, right? And I think the last count, if I'm not mistaken, on an average, each account now has between 3.5 to 5,000 rupees, very substantial, right? So that unbanked cash economy getting converted to the digital economy offers the opportunity for someone to migrate up from a zero balance account to something which of better service, right? It's a process of transition. Like as you rightly said about student starts with a zero balance account, builds a profile, becomes something, then becomes something. Now the journey may not be the same for a Jandan account, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, these folks and their kids will start becoming part of that massive banking enablement that needs to happen to get India into a digital economy.
Correct, Pankit. Uh, Pankit, moving on to our next question. Uh, what is your take on the importance of big data in fighting these online frauds and cyber attacks in banking industry?
Absolutely essential. What used to happen from a security perspective originally was using traditional RDBMS and rules-based engine to be able to identify threats or behaviors, right? So what would happen is that the way you would kind of classically do it is that if A happens and B happens, then the outcome is C. That's how it was always structured. Uh, with massive amount of data, with parameters that are completely amorphous, evolving over a period of time, that traditional database model is not sufficient. The only way you can do it is twofold. One is to bring big data so that you can have ability to objectify the data, to have NoSQL and that capability, and then bring AI on top of it. So instead of a predefined set of rules, because the problem with rules is that someone would have to think about the problem beforehand and then craft
Yeah.
a rule. If something
Yes.
new was to come, it was impossible for you to figure out how to use that new unless someone sat and understood a, a problem. Saying a new threat happened, and then you figure out how come I was not able to find that threat with the data and the rules that I wrote. Oh, by the way, it's because I missed that specific input that came. I did not apply that specific algorithm. So I will add it so that next time I can find it. But the first time around a new threat, I'll never be able to catch it because that's how the old way of working things is concerned. So
Correct.
with big data and ability to use AIML allows you to be responsive to the changing threat landscape that one faces today.
Yeah. Now, to your answer on use of ML and AI in banking operations, right? Uh, we are of the view that all these online frauds or cyber attacks, they're very difficult to preempt. Okay, so by the time you identify the culprits, the perpetrators, it's quite late, right? So what is the importance of AI and ML to create a predictive analysis of identifying a fraudulent transaction before it happens?
Yeah, so I think we covered it in bits and parts earlier also. But the way to think about it is that, generally speaking, most frauds are not a sum of zero and one. In the sense, it is not that an activity happens and the fraud happens immediately. There is a period of time that is there between the initiation of the fraud to the carrying out of the transaction. Now, it may be a few seconds, few minutes, few days, few months, few years, but there is some amount of time. So, predicting an attack may be a wrong way to look at it. uh, what one can do is to identify it as early or as close to the initiation as possible. So if I can identify it in the first few seconds, few minutes of it starting to manifest itself, I have a much better chance of preventing it, right? And that's where ML and big data plays a huge amount of role when you try and understand the behaviors that are exhibited through the life cycle of the fraud. It does a series of things before the financial or the final outcome in terms of transaction happens, right? So if you understand each of the steps, then you really know how to identify and where to interject and to see any anomalous behavior to stop it there.
Thank you, Pankit. Last question before we move to the audience queries and questions. Uh, what are the challenges in implementing digital initiatives in banking industry, and how can we overcome that?
So the biggest challenge is status quo. We like status quo. If it ain't broke, don't fix. It's working. We are still growing. Why do I do this? Right? So one is that. Second, it's a cost, a significant capital investment that is needed, and general inertia that exists within the organization that makes it difficult. And as they say, change is always easier to be done outside than is inside, right? So if you look at it, majority of the innovation that has happened in the digital transformation in the banks has happened outside of the banking industry. We had to create an NPCI to create a payment infrastructure. It didn't happen from the banks. Yes, banks were the co-owners and are the co-owners of NPCI, but it happened outside. It is a separate body that created that, and then it took a period of time, but now has become that fulcrum around which the whole entire digital infrastructure kind of got created. The Aadhaar infrastructure happened outside the government's way of identifying the citizenry, right? The open banking happened outside the banking ecosystem. It's someone else that did it. Payment wallets. I remember a time when I have friends in the banking industry, when I was talking to them about the early payment wallet companies, they just poo-pooed the whole idea, saying that it's a complete waste of time and how the people will make money, and that's a
Correct.
completely no, why should someone do it, right? So the inertia, the inability to accept that something better can come from outside makes it difficult for a change to happen from within. So that's how the nature of the beast is. And that's fine. That's completely fine so long as that outside becomes mainstream. And this is what has happened, right? So open banking has become mainstream. NPCI is now mainstream, right? And no, EKYC and a bunch of things that were originally completely not possible has happened, and credit to the banks that they have accepted it. Yeah, they understand that they can't do it, and they're willing to work with the external ecosystem to embrace it, which is fine.
Thanks, Pankit. I think we should now move on to the audience question, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
We have quite a number of questions coming from the audience. So let us take the first one. Uh, 5G mobile devices, are they more of a threat to cybersecurity? If so, what can banks do about it?
5G per se doesn't bring any threat. It's just a way, it is just a technology that makes communication faster. What 5G could potentially do, and what is the underlying assumption of risk, is that you can potentially get all your devices that today communicate. So today, how does the financial system interact? You have one is the mobile phone infrastructure. You have the banking physical channels infrastructure. You have the payment systems infrastructure, and you have the ATM infrastructure. Whatever you may say and count, the numbers of these are finite, like 500 million smartphones, 10 lakh ATMs, 1 lakh branches. It's a number that you can put your arms around it. What 5G enables is you can bring IoT devices onto the network, right? Which could be your refrigerators, your cars, your plants. All of them can be on the network because a high bandwidth now allows these IoT devices to be part of the mainstream. That potentially creates an opportunity for a mega attack where, let's say, a denial of service attack or some of those which were, while high, were still restricted, can completely go out of whack, because now you're not talking millions, you're talking about billions and trillions of devices, right? So 5G per se doesn't bring any security threat. It is what it enables could create a potential security risks for you as an organization.
Thanks, Pankit. Moving on to the next question. For loan-related frauds, apart from increasing monitoring of loans, what can banks do?
See, as I said, frauds are two parts. One is an insider enabled fraud, other is a cyber fraud. In loan cases, more often than not, it's an insider enabled fraud. Mili bhagat hai. People are in cahoots when they submit wrong information, which is accepted by someone in between, who then works the chain, and more often than not happens that route. There have been cases. One that comes to mind is something that happened in UP, if I'm not mistaken, where there was a whole agency that had created a separate infrastructure where they would go and talk to potential customers, where they would create fake documentations, take their checks, blank checks, their Aadhaar cards, OTP, cell phones, and they basically carried out malicious transactions. But that was nothing to do with loan. We basically used that loan vehicle as an ability to get personal information from each consumer and then use that information to be able to carry out transactions on their behalf and wipe out their bank accounts, right? But otherwise, loan fraud, maybe I'm wrong, but in my personal opinion, more often than not, is an insider-led event in some shape and form.
Third question goes like this: budgeting for cybersecurity controls. What is the right ratio against physical security related controls?
I don't understand the question clearly, but let me make an attempt of what I could understand. So budgeting for uh, in
So I
India,
guess
there is
the audience wants to understand, what is the ratio of budget we should allocate for a physical uh, controls, safety controls versus application level controls, is what they meant.
so again physical. They mean armed guards and CCTV cameras is a different topic altogether. I'm no expert on that to be able to say. I don't know what the bank spends, but I can talk about the cybersecurity aspect of it. The financial ecosystem comes under the Reserve Bank of India, which has laid down guidelines for banks, for fintech companies, for payment wallets, the entire value chains, if you may, of the financial ecosystem. The fairly categorical guidelines in terms of what each institution needs to do from a cybersecurity control perspective. So whether it is people, process, or technology. So they need to do a certain set of activities. And you have no choice but to invest in that. But as I mentioned, in a lot of cases, it ends up being a compliance centric thought process. So let me do the minimum that I need so that I can pass the RBI audit, right? If the thinking comes from that point of view, then you will more often than not shortchange the original intent that you needed to beef up the process, right? Historically, if you were to look at banks or institutions that have good security controls, roughly about 15 to 20% of their IT budget is allocated to cybersecurity. Good financial institutions run at that number. In India, that number is woefully short. If I'm not mistaken, it is low single digits in terms of how much they spend at a gross level. Now, there will be some who are at a much higher level, but at a gross level, if you take all the financial ecosystem in the country, the amount that is spent as a percentage of the IT is from on security is probably between 1.5 to 3%.
Uh, there's a very interesting question which has come up. What is the safest bank account you can open to avoid being subject to fraud or unauthorized transactions?
The bank account is always safe. It is how you bank, how you choose to bank with that bank account is where the problem lies, right? So the safest thing would be do not have a mobile app, do not go to internet, physically go to the bank, write physical checks, go and deposit cash, but then be worried about someone coming and stealing the cash if you're walking on the road. And just jokes apart. So I think as citizenry, there are a few things that one can do, and I have a blog. I will send it to you separately, Deepak. You can send it to your audience, which I talked about the simple things that we as citizens can do to safeguard ourselves from cyber attacks. It's basically, it stands for abide. ABID. A is antivirus, B is backup, I is identity, D is data, and E is enhance your software. Right. So that's how it is. It's as simple as 5-step process that one can do. But if you follow those simple things, simple hygiene work, it will make the attacker's life that much more difficult to come and steal either money or data or whatever it might be. If someone is wanting to steal your data, someone is wanting to attack you, the bad news is there's nothing you can do about it, right? Because they have enormous amount of resources at their disposal. The thing is that if you make it just hard enough, then for them it's the question of risk or reward, right? So do I need to spend half an hour going after Deepak's account, or maybe I'm finding someone who I can crack in less than a minute, right? So it is that question that, and you have to pose to the attacker that how difficult it is for you to steal my credentials. So is my password the same that I use for Facebook as well as my bank account? If it is, then if the Facebook password is hacked, then the bank account is also hacked, right? Simple things like these, if you keep basic hygiene into account, you should be okay.
Very true, Pankit. Uh, I would take the last question due to paucity of the time. This is a very generic question, but I feel this should be taken up here. How can we make customers aware about spoofing is actually the question, but if we take it to the larger arena, how can we make customers aware about these online frauds and these security attacks, these behavioral patterns, so that we augment the customers rather than bank to identify that there is fraudulent transaction that is going to happen?
So I'll talk about it in two parts. I'll talk about what we can do and what the regulatory agencies, governments, banks can do. So I'll take the first part or the last part first. I'll give you an analogy. Um, you are pretty young, most of the audience will be young, but in the 90s, unfortunately in India, you had a lot of these late 80s, 90s, a lot of these bomb blasts that used to happen in buses, in trains, railway stations, in bus stands, right? And this was called tiffin bombs. They used to put something in the tiffin or leave a bag of money or bag aside. And the curiosity, as I said, the curiosity killed the cat kind of thought process. The curiosity is what led to most people touching those stuff and invariably causing the attack, right? The There was a massive campaign by police, by government. If you go to airport, even now, there is a message that keeps coming and it's getting hammered to your hand. Do not touch unidentified objects. Right? It has now become second nature. Right? So if you see a bag at the airport, you are not going to think is a bag loaded with money. The first thought that comes to your mind is maybe it's a bomb. right?
Yeah.
So that's the level of subconsciousness that has become part and parcel of it, right? Now, extrapolate that to the internet world. If you see any message that comes to you asking for something, find a way to cross verify. Let's say if it's an email, you can go to the email header and right click. It will actually tell you the original underlying email. It will not be HDFC Bank, it will be some XYZ characters that are floating around. You know, it's not a bank email. You know that the bank is not going to ask for your account number. It is not going to ask you to, if someone is calling you on the phone, they are not going to ask for an account number. They are not going to call for a password. They are not going to ask for an OTP, right? There are things that have to become second nature to you when you do internet transactions. Third, if it is too good to be true, then it is too good to be true. If you are winning a lottery and someone is sending you a note and you have never participated in the lottery, then please do not click on the link.
Correct.
If you are getting a free gift of a BMW car, then you are not getting a BMW car. Your BMW car is going to go away.
Correct.
That's the thinking it has to happen, right? So
Correct.
the curiosity that one has, and so I use this term which is called as chai: curiosity, hubris, apathy, and ignorance. A social engineering attack plays into these four elements, right? So curiosity is fairly available. Hubris is, I'm the king, nothing is going to happen to me. Same thing, arrogance. And last is ignorance.
Correct.
Let us become aware. Let us become completely non-trusting. Just do not trust anything that comes on internet. Just do not trust any call that comes to you asking for any information whatsoever. Put the phone down. Put the phone down. Nothing is going to happen. You are not going to lose any money by putting the phone down, right?
Correct.
So there are things that has to happen. You need to figure out a way, whatever works for you. This is what I do. If I got a call from the bank, I'll just cut it down because bank doesn't need to call me. There's nothing that I do with the bank that needs to call me except for them to sell me more products, and I don't want to buy any more products. Simple.
Correct. Correct. Thanks, Pankit. I think we are through. Rest of the questions which are there, I think, would be answered by the blog link that you would share.
Sure.
Uh, that would take care. Uh, Before we wrap up, Pankit, I would like to thank you from INT side for sparing your precious 1 hour and enlightening us on this hot topic of online frauds and security threats.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
I would really thank you for your time, Pankit.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure
Thank
talking
you.
to you and to your guests. Have a safe online world and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Pankit. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.